Okay, let's dive in. We live in a world that's just absolutely saturated with information, right?
Mm.
Especially when we're trying to wrap our heads around these huge, complex topics, like, say, what actually holds our global civilization together. It is just incredibly easy to get completely lost in the noise.
Totally. Yeah.
You scroll through endless headlines, you hear sound bites, often contradicting each other, and, well, suddenly you're left feeling like you maybe understand everything and nothing all at once.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
But what if we told you there's one fundamental element, something often invisible or at least taken for granted, that underpins almost every single aspect of our modern lives?
The invisible force behind everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
An element so pervasive, so foundational, that if you really want to understand everything from, I don't know, the food on your plate to the intricate dance of the global economy, you simply have to understand it.
Precisely. And that's our mission today, really. To try and cut through some of that noise, take a bit of a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We're diving deep into the really meticulous work of Vaclav Smil. He's a scientist, I think, one of the most important thinkers of our time, honestly.
He really digs into the fundamentals.
He does. He literally unpacks how the world really works, and he does it primarily by focusing on energy.
Okay.
And what's profoundly fascinating here, I think, is how deeply, almost inextricably intertwined these energy conversions are with everything we consider modern progress.
Right.
As Smil puts it, and this is key, energy isn't just another economic factor, it's the very basis of life and evolution itself. He calls it the only truly universal currency.
The universal currency. I like that.
Yeah. And he really cuts through what he calls the fake news and the fantasies that often cloud our understanding, He reveals the stark material realities that, govern our existence.
So this deep dive, using his insights, should give us a really grounded understanding of this unseen power, the power that shapes our past, our present, and frankly, our collective future.
That's the goal.
Absolutely. And when Smil describes energy as the universal currency, it's, like you said, it's way more than just a clever metaphor. He means it's the bedrock, the foundation upon which every complex system, every single advancement, maybe even every living thing on Earth operates. It's a profound idea, really shifts your perspective.
It does.
So our modern history, then, isn't just a story of politics or social movements, is it? At its core, it's this rapid, successive sequence of transitions to entirely new and increasingly powerful energy sources.
Exactly. And to truly grasp this, you really have to cast your mind back. Think about the world before, say, 1800.
Right. What did that look like?
Well, human and animal muscles, that was it. They provided over 90% of all the mechanical energy used for farming, building, making things. Everything.
90%, wow.
And for heat and light. Over 98% came from simple biomass, plant fuels like wood, charcoal, straw.
Can you actually imagine living in that world now? A world where almost every physical task, every bit of warmth on a cold night, every flicker of light depended directly on the strength of a body, human or animal, or, the slow burn of wood.
It's a stark contrast to our instant-on reality, isn't it? Almost unrecognizable.
Totally.
And the shift from that world to ours wasn't just dramatic, it was incredibly swift, historically speaking.
Yeah, how swift.
Well, for centuries, biomass and muscle defined human capability, right? Then, the first cracks in that old way. By 1850, coal, which, had been around and used a bit, still supplied maybe 7% of all fuel energy globally. Barely anything.
Marginal.
Very marginal. Yet just 50 years later, by 1900, the whole landscape had fundamentally transformed. Modern sources, mostly coal, but increasingly crude oil too, had already surged to provide half of all primary energy worldwide.
In just 50 years.
50 years. And the momentum, the acceleration, it just kept going. By 1950, so only a century and a half after that pre-industrial baseline we talked about, fossil fuels made up nearly 3/4 of the world's primary energy supply.
75%.
Yeah. This wasn't some gradual shift. It was an energy revolution. Nothing like it in human history.
What I found really eye-opening in Smil's analysis looking at this transition is the sheer scale of the energy gain we've achieved. It's a scale that, honestly, it almost defies belief. Over the past 220 years or so, our direct use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas has increased. Wait for it. A staggering 1,500-fold.
1,500 times.
1,500 times. But believe it or not, that's not even the full picture.
No.
Smil emphasizes, and this is crucial, we also have to factor in the huge increase in efficiency, how good we've gotten at turning that raw energy into actual useful work.
Right. Getting more bang for the buck, so to speak. Powering machines, heating homes, moving cars.
Exactly. So when you combine the massive increase in fuel use with these incredible efficiency gains, the increase in useful energy available to humanity since 1800 is, well, it's an astounding 3,500-fold.
3,500 times.
Let that number just sink in. 3,500 times more useful energy than just 2 centuries ago?
Yeah.
It just reshapes your understanding of progress, doesn't it?
It really does. And it forces us to maybe shed some popular illusions, this immense mobilization of what Smil calls extrasomatic energy. It's a great term. Energy beyond human and animal muscle. Well, it has profound consequences.
Right.
The natural question from a number like that is, what does it all mean? What did we do with all that energy?
Yeah, what are the consequences?
And the answer, as Smil details so carefully, is that this unprecedented flood of available energy basically explains all the gains we associate with modern civilization.
All of them?
Pretty much. Think about it. Better eating, vastly more food globally, mass travel across continents and oceans, the mechanization of pretty much every industry.
Instant communication.
Instant communication, connecting billions. This huge abundance of useful energy is the invisible engine that allowed billions more people to achieve a higher standard of living, to move beyond just surviving, right? To live lives with some comfort, some opportunity.
So without this massive energy injection,
modern civilization as we know it, its complexity, its scale, its interconnectedness, it just wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
It's not an exaggeration. It's just a material reality.
And yet, despite this fundamental dependence, Smil points to something he calls a comprehension deficit in modern society, which I find fascinating. It's like a collective blind spot.
Yeah, explain that a bit.
Well, most modern city dwellers especially seem kind of disconnected from the actual, energy-intensive processes that deliver their daily needs.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. They don't really grasp how their food is produced, how the machines they use are built from raw materials. They don't see the scale, the iron ore coming from a mine, the blast furnace, the glowing steel.
Right. It's all hidden away.
And these foundational processes, energy, material delivery, they've somehow come to be seen as old-fashioned, maybe a bit boring compared to, say, the tech world.
Yeah, not as sexy as software.
Right. They don't attract the best minds, as Smil puts it, because those minds are often drawn to that world of seemingly weightless information, the electrons flowing through chips.
And this leads to a really dangerous misconception, doesn't it? Many of these data worshippers, as Smil calls them.
Provocative term.
It is, but maybe accurate. They seem to believe, almost like an article of faith, that electronic flows, data, will somehow magically make material necessities unnecessary.
Right, the dematerialization fantasy.
Exactly, fantasies of complete dematerialization. Huge farms replaced by vertical farms in cities. Synthetic stuff replacing food. Some even dream of terraforming Mars, like we can just ditch Earth eventually.
Yeah.
Smil, with his usual rigor, just dismisses these as grossly premature predictions. Or worse, fantasies fostered by a society where fake news has become common. He says reality and fiction have commingled so much that people believe things past observers would have seen as, well, frank delusion.
That's quite a critique.
It is, but it's a warning, too. Without understanding the fundamental material and energy realities, our big plans for the future might just be built on sand.
So embracing these narratives of a purely digital or dematerialized future, Smil's work is like a cold splash of water. A reminder. Those electrons still flow through physical wires, powered by physical plants, using materials from physical mines.
Grounded in reality.
And this disconnect means you, listening right now, might not even realize the huge energy cost embedded in your daily life. In every meal you eat, every device you touch, it's genuinely pervasive. And speaking of meals, let's bring this down to earth. Something we all do multiple times a day. Eat. Smil makes it crystal clear. Getting food, our most basic survival need, is fundamentally reliant on massive fossil fuel inputs, direct and indirect.
Yeah, it's not really a choice anymore. It's an imperative in the modern world.
That's right.
I mean, look at the history. For millennia, food production was almost entirely muscle power, human, animal, and, sunlight via photosynthesis.
Right, the old ways.
Think about 1801. Traditional farming, humans and oxen. Took about 10 minutes of human labor to get 1 kilogram of wheat.
10 minutes per kilo. Okay.
Fast forward a century, 1901. You've got mechanized, horse-powered farming, say, in the Dakotas. That cuts the human labor down dramatically to maybe 1.5 minutes per kilo.
That's a big improvement.
Huge. But today's farming, highly efficient, incredibly productive. It's radically different even from 1901.
Yeah.
It's almost unimaginable to those early farmers. We simply couldn't produce the sheer amount of food needed for 8 billion people using those old methods.
And a massive part of that radical difference, the real game changer, Smil identifies it as the primus inter pares, the first among equals of agricultural energy subsidies.
Such as?
Nitrogenous fertilizers.
Ah, yes, ammonia.
Exactly. The synthesis of ammonia, the basic ingredient for these fertilizers, depends heavily on natural gas. That's where the hydrogen comes from.
Right, methane reforming.
And you might ask, well, couldn't we get hydrogen differently, like from water using electricity?
Electrolysis, yeah, it's possible.
Possible, but Smil points out it's still stubbornly nearly 5 times more expensive than using natural gas.
So economically, natural gas wins out for fertilizer production.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
And to give you a really tangible sense of the energy cost here, 1 single kilogram of nitrogenous fertilizer, that stuff that makes crops grow like crazy, requires the energy equivalent of nearly 1.5 liters of diesel fuel just to produce it.
1.5 liters of diesel per kilo of fertilizer.
Before it even gets put on the field.
Wow. Okay. And that's just the fertilizer. When you start looking at the actual food on your plate, that fossil fuel pedigree, that hidden energy cost, it becomes even clearer, doesn't it?
Yeah, most people just don't see it.
Let's take some common examples Smil uses. Bread, a simple loaf of bread.
Okay.
Growing the wheat, transporting it, milling it into flour, then baking, say, a 1 kilogram sourdough loaf. That takes an embedded energy input equivalent to at least 250 milliliters of diesel fuel.
Quarter of a liter. Like a standard measuring cup full of diesel, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. Or if you have a smaller baguette, maybe about 2 tablespoons worth of diesel equivalent energy baked right in.
So, we talk about the energy cost of our diet. Maybe next time you bite into a lovely fresh tomato, you might just be tasting a hint of diesel.
Slight chuckle. Well, maybe not tasting it, but Smil does highlight tomatoes. A medium-sized one, maybe 125 grams, grown in a heated greenhouse in Spain, then shipped all the way to Scandinavia.
Okay, that's intensive.
Very. It has an embedded energy cost equivalent to about 650 milliliters of diesel fuel.
650. For 1 tomato, that's more than half a liter, over 5 tablespoons.
Yeah. It comes from the intense fertilization, heating those greenhouses year-round, and then, of course, the long-distance refrigerated transport.
Incredible. What about protein, like chicken?
Chicken's a good example. Producing just 1 kilogram of chicken protein, that's the protein itself, not the whole bird, requires about 4 liters of diesel fuel equivalent.
4 liters.
Yeah, when you account for everything, growing the feed, running the slaughterhouses, processing, packaging, refrigeration, all along the supply chain. It's incredibly energy intensive from start to finish.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what's the takeaway?
The takeaway is pretty stark. For decades to come, Smil argues, it will be virtually impossible to adequately feed the planet's growing population, over 8 billion now, heading towards 10 billion, without using fossil fuels. Both as direct energy sources for tractors, combines, irrigation pumps, and as the raw materials for those crucial fertilizers and pesticides.
And while the energy used on the farm might look small on paper, maybe 1% of total U.S. energy use.
Right, but that's misleading. The full food system is way more energy hungry. When you add up everything: processing, marketing, packaging, transport, retail, storage, cooking it at home or in restaurants.
The whole chain.
The whole chain. It adds up to nearly 20% of the entire U.S. energy supply.
1/5 of all energy used in the U.S. goes into the food system.
Yeah, that's a massive slice of the pie.
Which makes the challenge of decoupling our food from fossil fuels seem, well, immense, almost impossible with current tech at this scale, as Smil shows.
It really is. Feeding 8 billion people, let alone 10 billion, with pre-1920 farming methods is just not feasible.
Why not? What's the constraint?
Think about this. Back when the U.S. had its peak number of horses and mules for farm work, a full quarter, 25% of all U.S. farmland was needed just to grow feed for those animals.
A quarter of the farmland just for the animal power.
And they only had to feed about 105 million Americans back then. Imagine trying to feed 8 billion people globally with that kind of system today. Where would the land come from? It's simply not there.
Which underlines why synthetic fertilizers are so critical. You see it in the yields, U.S. corn yields, for example.
Right. Smil points this out. They soared from maybe 2 tons per hectare back in 1920 to an amazing 11 tons per hectare by 2020.
Wow, more than 5 times the yield.
And that leap in productivity, which feeds billions, is almost entirely down to those synthetic inputs derived from fossil fuels.
So real solutions for the future.
Yeah,
They have to be pragmatic, right? Focus on what we can actually do now.
exactly. Rather than just dreaming of technological silver bullets, Smil highlights two big areas. First, drastically cutting food waste.
Which is huge.
Huge. Globally, about a third of all food produced is wasted. And for things like root crops, fruits, vegetables, it's nearly half. Eliminating that waste would save enormous amounts of land, energy, water, everything.
Makes sense. What's the second area?
Moderate meat consumption, particularly in wealthy countries where people eat a lot of it. A big chunk of our global grain harvest goes to feeding animals, not people directly.
Right.
But Smil adds a crucial dose of realism here. He says the idea of mass-scale global veganism as the solution is, quote, doomed to fail.
Why? Doomed.
It's not a moral judgment. It's a practical assessment based on, well, human evolution, our biology, and crucially, the real nutritional needs of billions in lower-income countries who actually need more protein, often from animal sources, to improve their health and quality of life.
So it's more complex than just everyone going vegan.
Much more complex. The material reality, Smil argues, is that for many decades we will continue to be essentially eating transformed fossil fuels. It's baked into the system that feeds us.
Okay, so energy runs our food system, that's clear. But beyond food, our modern societies, the actual stuff that defines our lives, buildings, cars, computers, everything, they are literally built on four indispensable man-made materials.
The four pillars.
Smil calls them the four pillars of modern civilization. They are ammonia, which we've talked about for fertilizer, steel, concrete, and plastics.
Right. Ammonia, steel, concrete, plastics.
And what makes them so critical isn't just that they're useful, it's that we need them in absolutely massive and increasing quantities. And crucially, there aren't easy replacements on a mass scale, not without completely changing how we live.
The scale is just mind-blowing. These aren't niche materials.
Not at all. In 2019 alone, the world used about 4.5 billion tons of cement.
Billion with a B.
1.8 billion tons of steel, 370 million tons of plastics, and 150 million tons of ammonia. Colossal figures.
And it's this scale that really sets them apart, right?
Ooh.
People talk about silicon as the signature material of the electronic age.
Yeah, crucial for chip.
Crucial, yes. But we only produce about 10,000 tons of electronic-grade silicon wafers a year. Making it is super energy-intensive per ton, way more than steel or aluminum, but the volume is tiny compared to the pillars.
So silicon is important, but not an existential constraint in the same way.
Exactly. It's a critical component, but not a foundational bulk material like the big four. Those four are just pervasive, indispensable for our infrastructure.
And their energy footprint must be huge.
Immense, globally significant. Producing just those four materials, ammonia, steel, concrete, plastics, consumes about 17% of the entire world's primary energy supply.
17%, just four materials.
Yep. And they're responsible for roughly 25% of all CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels.
A quarter of global industrial carbon emissions just from making these four things.
Right. Which immediately brings up the absolutely critical question for the future. How on earth do we make these essential materials without relying so heavily on fossil fuels, if it's even possible at the scale we need?
And Smila's answer is?
This research is pretty clear. Right now, there are basically no commercially available, ready-to-deploy, mass-scale alternatives for making them without fossil carbon, either as fuel or feedstock. Not at scale. Even if we had unlimited, cheap, renewable electricity tomorrow, we'd still need to invent and build entirely new, large-scale industrial processes.
And that takes time.
Decades, Smil emphasizes. At best. This isn't a quick fix or an overnight switch. It's a massive long-term challenge.
Let's dig into the specifics for each one because it really shows the dependency. Ammonia, we covered for fertilizer, needs natural gas for hydrogen. Deeply locked in.
Deeply locked in. Steel, the backbone of everything, right? Bridges, cars, fridges, buildings.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Iron is abundant, Earth's fourth most common element. But making primary steel, using blast furnaces, incredibly energy intensive. We're talking 17 to 20 gigajoules of energy per ton of finished steel.
Okay, what about recycled steel? That's better, right? Electric arc furnaces.
Much better in terms of energy per ton. Yes,
Yeah.
only about 2 gigajoules per ton in an electric arc furnace, an EAF. But those EAFs need enormous amounts of electricity.
How much?
A single big EAF can use as much electricity each day as a city of maybe 150,000 people.
Wow. Okay, so recycling helps, but it has its own big energy demand, just electric instead of coal.
Exactly. And despite recycling efforts, primary steelmaking, the blast furnace route, still dominates globally. It produces more than twice as much new steel as recycled steel.
And the total energy hit for steel?
In 2019, global steel production alone accounted for about 6% of the world's total primary energy supply.
6% just for steel. Okay. Then there's concrete, the foundation of cities.
Literally. Since 2007, more than half of us live in cities, and concrete is, well, just look around you. Sidewalks, foundations, roads, bridges, skyscrapers. It defines the modern urban landscape.
Can't escape it.
And making it is inherently energy intensive. You have to heat minerals up to a blistering 1,500 degrees Celsius to make cement clinker, the key binder.
1,500 degrees C, that takes fuel.
Lots of it. And the scale. Between 1990 and 2020, Smil estimates nearly 700 billion tons of concrete were put in place globally.
700 billion tons. That's
Right.
almost impossible to visualize.
It is. A truly monumental amount of material, requiring a monumental amount of energy.
And the last pillar, plastics.
Plastics. Incredibly diverse, light, strong, and utterly ubiquitous now.
Keys, mouse, chair. Yep, touching plastic right now.
Exactly. Their synthesis is deeply rooted in fossil fuels. It starts with steam cracking hydrocarbons from crude oil and natural gas to get the basic building blocks, the monomers.
Yeah.
And those same hydrocarbons also provide the energy for the later synthesis steps.
So fossil fuels are both the ingredient and the energy source.
Pretty much. And production has just exploded. From maybe 20,000 tons globally in 1925 to 370 million tons by 2019. It's everywhere, and every bit has that embedded fossil fuel energy cost.
So this is a decarbonization dilemma for these four pillars: ammonia, steel, concrete, plastics. It sounds like one of the biggest hurdles we face, doesn't it?
It's massive,
Yeah.
perhaps one of the very largest. As we've seen, there are currently no ready-to-go scalable alternatives for making them without fossil carbon, either as feedstock or fuel.
It's not just about switching power sources.
No. Even if we had endless clean electricity, we still need entirely new industrial processes. Smil stresses this repeatedly. It's a huge technological and engineering challenge that's decades away from commercial reality, not some quick fix. It means fundamentally rethinking industrial chemistry and metallurgy on a global scale. And this deep reliance on energy from materials and food, it naturally leads us to another key piece of how the world really works: globalization.
Right, the interconnected world.
Modern globalization, the way it is now, its sheer extent, its intensity, it's not just about trade deals or culture swapping. It is directly, fundamentally enabled by technology. Specifically, new prime movers, the engines, turbines, motors that move everything, and the incredibly fast advancements in communication tech. And every single one of those, from a simple engine to a massive data center, runs on vast amounts of energy.
Makes sense. Historically, connections were much harder.
Incredibly limited, laborious. Sails were the first big thing, maybe 5,000 years ago. They linked distant places, allowed some trade, but it wasn't intensive or reliable, dependent on the wind.
Then came steam.
Steam engines. A revolution. Though Watt's improved engine came out in the 1770s, it spread pretty slowly. Only 500 sold by 1800, didn't really take off until around 1850.
So slow diffusion initially.
Yeah, but it was steam that made long-distance lengths more common, more intensive, and crucially, more predictable. Steamships, especially once they got screw propellers and steel hulls, could reliably chug along at 30-40 kilometers an hour.
Faster than sailing ships.
Much faster and more reliable than even the fastest clippers, which maybe averaged 20 kilometers an hour and were totally wind dependent. And on land, steam trains, locomotives from 1829, widespread by the 1870s, they truly opened up continents.
Right. Transcontinental travel became possible.
Exactly. Think about Joseph Conrad's novels. His characters are always ending up in these far-flung places. That's a direct result of this era of mass trade and travel, all powered by steamships and trains.
Steam shrunk the world.
It did. But if we connect this to the even bigger picture, the internal combustion engine, spreading widely after 1900, just put globalization into overdrive.
Cars, trucks.
And ships. Rudolf Diesel's engine, more efficient, running on cheaper fuel, absolutely revolutionized shipping and heavy machinery. Smil argues that without diesel engines, bulk trade across oceans, grain, oil, minerals, manufactured goods would be a tiny fraction of what we see today.
So diesel was key for bulk shipping.
Absolutely key. Look at oil tankers. Before 1950, a typical one might carry 16,000 deadweight tons. That's its total capacity. By the mid-1960s, we had VLCCs, very large crude carriers, hauling 180,000 to 320,000 tons.
Wow, a huge jump in capacity. Why?
Driven directly by cheap Middle Eastern oil becoming available, it completely changed global energy flows and trade.
And the other big shipping innovation, containers.
Ah, yes, Malcolm McLean's brilliant idea in 1957. Container shipping. It transformed cargo transport almost beyond recognition.
Standard boxes, easy to move.
Exactly. Uniform steel boxes moving seamlessly from ship to train to truck. An integrated intermodal chain. And the ship capacity just kept growing. Between 1973 and 2019, the maximum number of containers on the biggest ships jumped 12-fold, from under 2,000 to nearly 24,000.
12 times.
And that required converting railways and trucking worldwide to handle these boxes, creating this global logistics network that brings stuff from a factory in China to a store near you incredibly fast and cheap.
And for people, jet travel.
Jetliners. The Boeing 747, the jumbo jet from 1969, utterly transformed long-distance human travel. Smil estimates 747s alone carried maybe 5.9 billion people, like three-quarters of the world's population at the time, over 5 decades.
Enabling mass tourism, rapid business travel.
Mass tourism, fast delivery of high-value goods, forging connections that were just impossible before, all thanks to powerful, energy-hungry jet engines.
And alongside all this physical movement, there's the digital side. Communication.
Equally energy-intensive in its own way. Microchips. The progress there is almost unbelievable. Moore's Law in action.
How much progress?
Intel's first microprocessor in 1971 had about 2,300 components. By 2019, an AMD CPU had 39.5 billion transistors. Let me check. A 17.1 billion times increase in processing power in under 50 years.
17 billion times.
Staggering. And that allows for the massive data flows, instant email, video calls, and navigation systems like GPS.
Right, GPS, we take it for granted now.
Totally. The U.S. system went live in '93. Then came Russia's GLONASS, Europe's Galileo, China's Beidou.
Yeah.
They allow real-time tracking of everything, ships, planes, your pizza delivery.
All requiring satellites, ground stations, huge processing.
All requiring immense energy and material inputs to build and operate constantly.
It really is incredible to think that the phone in your pocket, the internet you rely on, all these seemingly dematerialized flows of information, they're ultimately built on incredibly energy-intensive processes and need vast physical infrastructure.
Exactly. The digital world might feel weightless, like it exists in the cloud, but it's fundamentally grounded in material and energy. Smil points out a tiny detail that shows the scale. Those little motors that make your phone vibrate. Some are tiny, less than 4 millimeter by 3 millimeter, but they're now made in numbers comparable to any other type of electric motor globally. Over 1.37 billion sold in 2019 alone, each one needing materials and energy.
Wow.
And the ultimate dependency, the really stark reality. Without reliable electricity and the infrastructure that supports it, which is mostly steel, remember, cities wouldn't have drinking water because the pumps wouldn't work. Even fossil fuels themselves wouldn't be available because their extraction, processing, and transport all rely heavily on electric pumps.
It's all connected, a vast energy-hungry system.
Deeply interconnected and deeply energy dependent. So all of this complex, deeply embedded energy reality brings us right to the biggest challenge of our time.
Decarbonization.
Right. Climate change, net zero targets.
Exactly. Growing concerns about global warming have led quite rightly to widespread calls for rapid decarbonization. Aiming for net zero by 2050 is a common goal. But this is where Smil, with his characteristic pragmatism and focus on data, provides a really crucial corrective.
A reality check. A reality check on what he sees as fundamentally unrealistic claims and overly optimistic projections. The scale of the challenge is just immense.
Oh, immense.
Annual global CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels hit over 37 billion tons in 2019. To actually achieve rapid decarbonization, we'd need to displace and replace something like 10 billion tons of fossil carbon every year.
10 billion tons of carbon, not CO2, but carbon itself.
Carbon itself. And Smil's point is that's not something you achieve with government targets or slogans alone. He says this is not a biased personal impression, but a realistic conclusion based on engineering and economic realities.
Physics and economics set the limits, not just political will.
That's his argument, yeah.
So when we hear these promises, we'll just switch to renewables overnight, or we'll hit this target by 2030, how does that stack up against the physics and economics Smil talks about?
Well, electricity's great.
Yeah.
Clean, efficient where you use it. So electrifying everything seems like a good goal. However, the massive bottleneck, the thing Smil hammers home, is the lack of affordable, truly mass-scale, long-term electricity storage.
The intermittency problem. Sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow.
Exactly. And think about the scale. Right now, there's just no affordable way to store enough electricity to power a medium-sized city, say 500,000 people, for even a week or two straight, let alone a megacity of 10 million plus for maybe half a day.
We just can't do that yet.
Not affordably, not at that scale. The only really viable large-scale option we have now is pumped hydro storage PHS, pumping water uphill, letting it flow down later.
Right, like a big battery using gravity?
Kind of, but it has big limits. You need specific geography, mountains and valleys, suitable sites are rare, and you lose about 25% of the energy in the process, pumping it up and getting it back.
And compared to actual batteries.
The scale difference is profound. Take the largest battery storage facility currently in Florida, impressive, 900 megawatt hours. But the largest PHS facility, Bath County in Virginia, holds 24 gigawatt hours. That's a 1,300-fold difference in capacity.
1,300 times more storage in the hydro facility than the biggest battery.
Yeah, there's a huge gap between current battery tech and what's needed for grid-scale, long-duration storage.
Any real-world examples of this challenge?
Smil points to Germany's Energiewende, their big energy transition push. They boosted wind and solar capacity massively, tenfold since 2000. Huge investment.
And the result?
By 2020, renewables made up about 40% of their electricity generation, which is significant progress. But nearly half their electricity still came from fossil fuels.
Still nearly half fossil. Why?
Because they still need power when it's cloudy and calm. They actually still maintain 89% of their fossil fuel power plant capacity ready to go, just for those times. They haven't been able to shut down the coal and gas plants because they need that reliable backup.
So the transition is harder than it looks, even for electricity.
Much harder. And it gets even tougher when you look beyond electricity. Remember, electricity is only about 18% of global final energy consumption.
Only 18%. What's the other 80+%?
That's powering heavy industry, heating homes and buildings, fueling transport cars, trucks, ships, planes, and making all those foundational materials we talked about: ammonia, steel, cement, plastics.
And decarbonizing that huge chunk is even harder.
Much harder. As we discussed, there are currently no commercial scalable ways to make ammonia, steel, cement, plastics just using electricity at the volumes we need. And long-distance transport, trucking, flying, shipping. Still incredibly difficult to decarbonize without liquid fossil fuels. Batteries are too heavy for long-haul planes and trucks right now, and hydrogen tech isn't there yet at scale either.
The energy density of liquid fuels is just hard to beat for those applications.
Very hard to beat. Which leads Smil to talk about carbon lock-in.
Lock-in, meaning?
Meaning the sheer inertia of our existing energy system, the infrastructure we've built over decades, and the painfully slow, real pace of transition despite all the talk and investment.
How slow?
Look at Germany again. Despite the Energiewende, their total primary energy share from fossil fuels only dropped from 84% to 78% over 2 decades. A tiny change.
Why so slow overall?
Because, as Smil puts it bluntly, material realities and human desires create inertia. Germans still like their unrestricted Autobahn speeds and their frequent intercontinental flying, and German industries hum on natural gas and oil. Life goes on.
And it's not just Germany.
No. Japan, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, actually saw its fossil fuel share increase from 83% in 2000 to 90% in 2019 as they relied more on fossil fuel power plants. The U.S. still 80% fossil fuels in 2019.
What about China? They've built huge amounts of renewables.
They have. And their share of fossil fuels fell from 93% to 85%. But here's the kicker. Their absolute energy demand nearly tripled in that time. Their economy grew so fast.
So even with massive renewable growth,
their sheer scale of growth meant their total fossil fuel use went way up, driving global fossil fuel consumption up by about 45% in the first 2 decades of this century.
So globally, despite all the renewable expansion,
the overall global fossil fuel share in primary energy barely budged, fell only slightly from about 87% to maybe 84%.
Wow. So renewables are mostly meeting new demand, not really displacing the existing fossil fuel base quickly.
That's largely what the data shows, yeah. Which leads Smil to be pretty sharp about what he calls unrealistic expectations.
Like what?
Claims of hitting 100% renewables by 2030, the kind you see in some Green New Deal scenarios. Smil labels them quantitative fables or even frank delusion.
Strong words.
Yeah, but he argues history just doesn't unfold like a neat computerized academic exercise where lines on a graph smoothly go to zero because a policy says so.
Right. The real world is messy.
Very messy. The global energy system is this monumentally complex, deeply entrenched thing. It involves moving over 10 billion tons of fossil carbon around every year. It converts energy at an incredible rate, 17 terawatts continuously.
17 terawatts.
Right.
Hard to grasp that scale.
It's like the continuous output of maybe 17,000 large nuclear power plants running flat out 20 and 47, or enough power to run every household in the world hundreds of times over every second.
Okay, that's huge.
Given that immense scale and inertia, Smil concludes that a sudden abandonment or a rapid demise of fossil fuels is simply impossible. It has to be a gradual decline.
And maybe slower than we think.
Maybe even slower than past transitions. He points out that the current decarbonization transition seems to be happening slower than the rate at which fossil fuels displaced traditional biomass back in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Slower than the last big energy shift. That's sobering.
It is. And here's another really sobering fact Smil brings up. Committed warming. Meaning, because of all the CO2 we've already put into the atmosphere, we were already committed to at least 2.3 degrees Celsius of global warming compared to pre-industrial times.
Even if we stopped all emissions today.
Even if all emissions miraculously stopped instantly. The climate system has momentum. Past actions have already locked in a certain amount of future warming.
So adaptation is crucial regardless of mitigation efforts.
Absolutely. And the price of effective action to mitigate further warming, Smil says it will be decidedly non-magical, gradual, and costly.
No quick fixes, and it won't be cheap.
Exactly. And there's no immediate economic payoff for the generation that undertakes these really expensive decarbonization efforts. The benefits, avoiding future climate disasters, protecting ecosystems, those are decades away.
So the people paying now won't necessarily see the main benefits themselves?
Not directly, not in economic terms. One climate economy model Smil cites suggests the break-even point for big mitigation efforts started in the early 2020s wouldn't even arrive until around 2080.
2080. That raises really tough questions about intergenerational fairness, doesn't it? Are we willing to make big sacrifices now for benefits that mostly go to our grandkids or great-grandkids?
That's the difficult question Smil leaves us with. Hashtag tag outro.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Vaclav Smil's perspective, let's just circle back to his central, really profound message.
Please do. Our modern world, everything from the food on your plate to the concrete and steel in your cities, the global connections that link us all, it's profoundly, almost invisibly dependent on energy. And overwhelmingly, that energy still comes from fossil fuels. It's the fundamental material reality that defines our existence right now.
And the aha moment for you listening should really be this. Getting a handle on this material reality is absolutely critical. It's like an antidote to the overly simplistic stories we often hear, right? About instant fixes or dematerialized futures where, bits and bytes just magically replace tons of steel and liters of diesel.
Right, it grounds us.
It does, and it shows the challenge ahead transitioning our energy system is just immense. Unprecedented in the pace and scale required, and tangled up with every single aspect of our lives.
Which leads to that really important question Smil himself poses. Can humanity actually achieve its aspirations? Lifting billions from poverty, creating a more prosperous, equitable world. Can we do all that within the safe operating boundaries of our planet's biosphere? Can we avoid catastrophic climate change?
And his answer.
He's very frank. There are no easy answers, no simple magic solutions. But he stresses, absolutely stresses, that it is imperative that we first understand the cold, hard facts of the matter.
Know the reality before you try to change it.
Exactly. Only then, with a clear-eyed view of these material realities, can we even hope to tackle the problem effectively, with realistic expectations, and with strategies that might actually work.
So what does this all mean for you then, as you try to navigate this world that's just brimming with confident claims, counterclaims about our future, about energy, about climate action?
I think it means trying to see the world as it really works, like Smil's book title says, not just as we wish it would work, or how we're told it conveniently should work.
And Smil, importantly, he isn't just about pointing out the problems, is he? He does identify solutions, adaptations, things we can do, often things that get overlooked.
That's a really key point. He points to the solutions that are often overlooked because everyone's chasing the next big magical or disruptive tech breakthrough like mass-scale batteries or carbon capture things that just aren't ready at the scale we need yet.
So what are these overlooked solutions?
Things that aren't glamorous, maybe, but are effective, like seriously cutting per capita energy demand, especially in rich countries. Simple things like much, much better building insulation. And, as we discussed, drastically reducing food waste that's real, low-hanging fruit for saving energy and resources.
Practical stuff we can do now.
Practical stuff. So the real question, Smil seems to suggest, isn't so much if we can eventually build a more sustainable future, but will we? Will we act effectively, with foresight, even when the immediate payoffs aren't obvious and the costs are high?
Or will we just wait until conditions get so bad we're forced to act, maybe when it's too late for some things?
Exactly. And what role will you, the listener, play in that? Will you engage with these complex realities, understand them, advocate for realistic approaches? Or is it easier to just go along with the easier but maybe ultimately misleading fantasies?
It's a question that definitely demands some serious thought from all of us, something to chew on.
Absolutely. A lot to think about.